It is a great delight and a great honor to welcome Tamara Leach on this program. She is an activist, best known to be one of the key figures in the 2022 Canada Freedom Convoy truckers protests, and she authored a book based on her experiences. It is titled "Hold the Line: My Story from the Heart of the Freedom Convoy." Tamara, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing really well. Thank you.
So my first question is, tell me about your life before the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes, well, I born and raised on the prairie provinces here in Canada, in Saskatchewan in particular, but I've spent time in both Alberta and Manitoba. Predominantly, I worked in oil and gas here in Alberta, so I saw firsthand some of the Liberal government's anti-energy legislation and how that was affecting people that I worked with and people that I cared about. And so I started getting involved, going to rallies, and I guess becoming an activist, and advocating for the rights of the people that are working in the energy sector here. And it just then the pandemic hit. My husband and I both lost our jobs, as did so many people in the country and around the world. And I was just becoming really frustrated and sad by watching people losing their livelihoods and their businesses, not being able to see their families. And so, yeah, so then this opportunity came up and I got a hold of Chris Barber, and the rest is history, as they say.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. So tell me about I guess, the natural gas, fossil fuel industry you have there in Alberta.
Yes, it's predominantly natural gas here. Of course, being in the energy sector, we have booms and busts, which we expect here. It all depends on the price of gas and the price of oil. But it seems that our government has been really trying to quash our industry here in Alberta, and it's really affecting a lot of people. And when we should be doing the opposite, because Canada has one of the most environmentally friendly and efficient energy industries in the world. We should be celebrating that instead of trashing it, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Mhm. So I'm guessing this is why you were against Justin Pierre Trudeau from the start, right?
Yes, yes, yeah.
Mhm. Um, I wonder, were you politically active before the pandemic, as well as the Ottawa Freedom Convoy truck protest began?
Yes, I was. I sat on the board of directors for a Western Independence Party called the Maverick Party.
Mhm.
I'm sure you heard about Brexit in the
Yes.
UK. So after the 2019 election, we started a gentleman here in Alberta actually started what he called Wexit. And so I joined that organization, and then we morphed into both Alberta or, provincial parties as well as a federal party. And I sat on the board of directors for the federal party.
Mhm. I see.
Yeah.
So, do you sense a connection between the current, I'm guessing, still Liberal government headed by Justin Pierre and his stance towards the truckers as they were voicing their legitimate grievances?
And sorry, what was the question again?
Oh, sorry. The connection between Trudeau's positions on natural gas and fossil fuel versus his views on the truckers in general.
I think generally speaking, he doesn't want to see the Western provinces be more powerful and more autonomous. I think what we've seen out of the Trudeau Liberal government here in Canada is that he styles himself as a bit of a dictator, and he doesn't like to be questioned, and he likes us to just do exactly what he says we should do and not ask any questions.
Yeah, I do sense a sort of like benign, almost like maternal, like dictatorship coming from Justin Pierre ever since he assumed the role of prime minister. I guess one thing that Canada should be sarcastically proud of is that it has led the world in the wokeification of its politics. The Justin Trudeau, I think, is the preeminent symbol of wokeism. I wonder if you agree to that.
I totally agree to that. Yes. That seems to be his whole platform is based on hurt feelings.
Yeah. So I think there's been a growing, I guess, tension between the people who call them who are elites, who are the rulers, and it's not just the government, people who are in government, but the people who work in the big time media outlets, CBC included too, and those who work in academia versus people like yourself who are, I guess, just folks who are of the working in middle class who, who have to worry about uh, I guess, more real life concerns than them. And the first instance I noticed about it is that people who are of the elite class, they worry a disproportionate amount about the environment and climate change. And almost everything you hear from the regarding like climate change hysteria and such comes from them. Whereas people of the working middle class, they care about making a living. They care about securing their either their mortgage or their income level, and of course, before the pandemic, their jobs. And because the fossil fuel natural gas industry is the job creator, is the one that ensures these livelihoods, those who are of the working and middle class, especially those who know people with jobs, with who has jobs in them, they are more concerned with keeping the fossil fuel industry, maintaining it, and not the elites because environmental concerns, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, the climate change agenda. I mean, I think we can all be fairly responsible. I mean, I don't agree with the way that the governments are really shoving it down our throats. I mean, I think we are for the most part responsible people, and I mean, nobody wants to see um, our planet destroyed. So, but you're right. I mean, a lot of the middle class people, they just want to feed their families,
Mhm.
you know. It's easy for the upper class to sit back and criticize, but we've got kids to feed and families to raise and bills to pay.
Mhm. And not to mention that right now, because of a lack of alternative, viable alternative fuel sources, we still have to run our cars and houses and everything on fossil fuels.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes, there's actually a bit of a debate going on with the premier of Saskatchewan right now because of course they want to phase out coal
Mhm.
here in Canada completely by I believe it was 2030, and the premier came out and said that's not possible. I mean, if you want Saskatchewan people to be able to heat their homes and to be able to afford to heat their homes, that's not living in reality.
Mhm. Yeah, so I wonder, how do you balance the, I guess, environmental concerns, which can be legitimate, versus the concerns of working people who are trying to make a living?
That's a really good question. I don't know how you would do that. I think education and awareness is key. And I think, like I said, just appealing to people's sense of responsibility without demanding that they do something.
Hmm. Yes. And tell us about how you and your family managed to, I guess, live through the pandemic.
Well, after we lost our jobs, which was in early or late March 2020, my husband and I actually drove out to Manitoba to visit my daughter, and it turned out that she was expecting a baby. So
No,
we
congratulations.
came back here and thank you, packed up our stuff and spent most of the pandemic out in Manitoba working on the farm and just trying to be productive. There was really nothing going on in our city at all. So our choice was to either just stay at home and sit on our couch by ourselves or go out to the farm and be productive and help out. And so we spent about 18 months there.
Hmm. Well, I'm glad to hear it, and I'm glad to hear that you're still keeping it productive during the pandemic time because I was actually in Canada during the 2020, 2021, and the first few months were really hard because I was at school then, and school was basically closed, and they were figuring out the online classes thing. So yeah,
Mhm.
it took some time to adjust.
Yes.
So, how come you became one of the members of the Freedom Convoy protests?
Well, as I said earlier, I was quite frustrated with a lot of the damage that I was seeing being done to our society. And I contacted Chris Barber. I got his number through a friend of mine, and I got a hold of him and I said, you know, these are my skills. My background is logistics, organization, and administration. I said, you guys are going to need some money. You're going
Mhm,
to need social media. And I said, I'm glad to help out any way that I can. And so that's how that started. And I think I just became the familiar face of it because I start as the donations started pouring in, and they were quite substantial. Um, I was really concerned with people that had donated to that they felt comfortable and they got a sense of who I was and who we were as an organization. I wanted them to feel confident that, you know, we were going to look after their money, make sure that the donations got to where they wanted it to go. And so I started doing the lives. And then, of course, as we started our journey across Canada, we continued those lives to show the crowds on the side of the road and then on the overpasses and just the celebration and the unity that we saw all across the country.
mhm. So, do you happen to know personally any truck drivers before the protest started?
I know lots of them actually. I worked at a oil and gas services company up until I was rearrested last summer, and so yeah, I worked with all truck drivers. My parents run a pilot truck business, so they're the vehicles that you see in front of the big loads with the light bars on their vehicles.
Mhm,
So yeah, yeah, I know a lot of truck drivers,
mhm.
even more now.
Wow. Yeah. So, what do you believe are some of the challenges faced by truck drivers in their jobs that I guess people like Trudeau and those who run the big media outlets do not understand?
Well, I mean, specifically through the pandemic, I mean, they didn't have places to stop and eat. They weren't allowed to use washrooms. They weren't allowed to use the public showers. I mean, this really, really affected them in some terrible ways too. And then, of course, with the mandates coming in, he basically was saying if you're not vaccinated to cross the border, then you have to quarantine for 2 weeks. But I mean, who can afford that? I
Hmm.
mean, if your job is traveling across the border, you can't quarantine and be able to feed your family every time you cross the border. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think they had a lot of challenges at the beginning of the pandemic. Our prime minister hailed them all as heroes and likened them to soldiers going off to war and praised them repeatedly. And then when he put the mandates in, he really started to vilify them, which was terrible.
Oh yes, yes, I remember this from the beginning. You know, in the first few months, there was this Twitter campaign to praise quote unquote frontline workers, you know, the doctors and
Hmm.
nurses and those who deliver food from places to place, as well as the, I guess, grocery store employees. And you know, in I think in New York or something, they have this thing with during 6 or 7 p.m. each evening, they would like bang pots and pans to, I guess,
Mm,
to support them. But I think that changed drastically when the, I guess, vaccine was devised, and then the mandates start to roll in, and suddenly those who do not feel comfortable with it are vilified. Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it was quite a stunning about face that he did there. What to you know, from praising them as heroes to how he ended up treating them in the end.
mhm.
Disgraceful.
And of course, I've held this unpopular opinion for ever since the pandemic started, but I think I guess the COVID-19 virus itself is, although it can have like severe health effects, and it has certainly claimed uh a disproportionate amount of lives, the real pandemic, or at least the real consequence of the pandemic, is the increasing control of our governments, especially Western governments, in
Yes.
this kind of paternalistic way. And and these emergency measures that we haven't seen since time immemorial being applied in order to, in an attempt to reduce the rate of people being infected and whatnot. And I think that include the vaccine mandates too. I don't know if this applies to you, but when I was living in Ontario, we had to bring out a certificate or a digital app thing that confirms our vaccination status before we can enter restaurants. And there was this time where we had to wear masks even when we're outside, and we we go into the restaurants and we still have to wear masks unless if we are eating food, which in
Right.
itself is irrational.
There was a lot of really irrational mandates and measures that were put into place that just did not make any sense, no sense whatsoever. And I don't know what happened. I don't know if they started putting on some of these, implementing some of these mandates and just really liked the sense of control that they got. And I mean, when the convoy started here in Canada, the rest of the world was actually easing up on most of their mandates and restrictions. So it was really odd that our country was almost doubling down. I mean, they were talking about stopping interprovincial travel here in Canada, which to me was quite alarming because I got family in other provinces and a granddaughter 2 provinces away. So I don't know if they just got greedy and enjoyed that or what they were thinking, but I mean, it was definitely an overreach, a gross overreach.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I remember too that even after I got I guess the two necessary shots to that they demanded of me, they obviously the demand for boosters kept coming in, and I thought, if the vaccine it really works as it is advertised, I'm not saying that it doesn't work, but I'm just saying that I guess the degree to which it works is not the same as what we have been told it works. So if it works the
Right.
same way, then why do we need 3 or 4 of them?
Yeah.
And every 5 to 6 months, another one. And and why can we go on, I guess, air transit or any sort of public transit in order to visit our families who also have been vaccinated? And this happened to me too, but my relatives did not just live in another province of Canada, they live in another country, that is Vietnam.
Right.
So for almost 2 years, I was stuck in Canada while I could have just went back to my home country anytime.
Mm, yes.
So I'm actually left Ontario on December of 2021, so I miss all the fun of the uh,
Uh,
the truckers' protests. But of course, a bit of history in that the way I read it from home is that obviously one of the job requirements of the truckers is they have to travel from the Canada to U.S. borders, and one of the federal, I believe, legislation is that when you make the leg trip back from the U.S. to Canada, you have to have a vaccine certificate in order to be admitted back to Canada. Is that correct?
I think it was correct. That's been lifted now. Yeah. But I think it was you either had to present a vaccination, proof of vaccination,
Mhm.
or you had to quarantine for 2 weeks.
I see. Yes.
Yeah, 14 days. Yeah.
Mhm. And given what you've described about the life and the harsh job requirements of the truck drivers, even before the pandemic started, and during the pandemic, when I guess the pressure on their jobs is much more because they are considered essential workers. That is just undue. That presents an undue burden on them, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. Excuse me. Sorry, I just caught a cold the other day. Um, yeah, like I said, I mean they were made out to be heroes and compared to soldiers, like I said, and then all of a sudden completely vilified.
Mhm,
And let's be honest, I mean, they work in an industry where their days go by where they don't have any contact with other people. They live in their trucks. They
mhm, yeah,
sleep in their trucks. They eat in their trucks,
yeah.
So it didn't make much sense.
Mhm. So I'm guessing you were in the field with them in Ottawa. So tell me about meeting these I guess alleged Nazi fascist sexists that Justin Trudeau described them to be.
White supremacists and racists
Yeah,
also.
that too.
They're a fantastic bunch of people, and I've said it so many times, they are the real heroes in this story, as well as the Canadian people. I mean, without the Canadian people coming out to support us and donate money, it would have been just a few trucks driving across Canada. But what I learned about the truckers is that they're hardworking.
Mhm,
They're very family oriented. They care about their country, but they're also very strong and independent thinkers, I mean, when we were there, that was one of the most beautiful things about the protest is that there weren't really any leaders, it was very organic. Everybody worked together for a common purpose. And they're wonderful, wonderful human beings, all of them. I was so proud, with the group that we had formed, the core group of people that we'd formed, proud of each and every one of them. And every single one of them was there just simply to, stop the mandates and stop the overreach.
mhm. And of course, to follow up on that answer of yours, in what ways do you believe the truckers' protest, yourself included, reflect what it means to be a Canadian?
Well, it was the most beautiful celebration of unity I've ever seen in this country. And I don't know about politics in other countries for sure, but I know in Canada, specifically in our last election, our prime minister used the pandemic and the vaccines as a wedge issue. And so he was really coming out, well, you heard it, asking if we should be tolerated, and said we're racists and misogynists and we don't believe in science and all this nonsense. I mean, who talks about their own people that way? And I said it in my testimony at the inquiry into the Emergencies Act. If you are going to lead a country, you lead everybody in your country. You don't just get to pick and choose those people that align with your ideologies. You have to be a leader for everyone. And he failed miserably in that regard. And so, with the truckers going, it really shows their character. I mean, they came after our public health frontline workers, the doctors, the nurses, and then went after the military, and then they went after the RCMP. And it was when they came after the truckers that they said, "Heck no, this ain't happening," and they drew their line in the sand.
Mhm. And of course, aside from the truckers, there are some local citizens of Ottawa. They also participated in the protests. And of course, there's an amount of people who complain about the noise and such, since there was a lot of honking. But for the most part, there are footage that I see of these alleged white supremacists to be people of like Indian and Sikh descent, and they were performing like Bhangra music. So, very white supremacists of them there.
Well, I'll tell you the biggest moment for me was our second day, I think it was, and we were driving through Winnipeg. And as we were coming along the highway, I looked out the window and I saw native drummers
Mm,
drumming in their full regalia. And I saw a group of Sikh gentlemen standing beside them. And I saw Hutterite women and children holding signs beside them, and nuns in full habits. There was people of every color, people from every culture. I mean, people from every income bracket. It was the most amazing show of unity, because right then it didn't matter what
mhm,
color you were or what god you worshipped or where you lived in the country. We were just all Canadians,
mhm.
and it was beautiful. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, that for me revealed two things about, I guess, Canadian society and government. One being very beautiful in that after being secluded from each other for what, 18 or so months, we finally have a
Yes.
chance to get together. No one really cares about whether you have the vaccines or which vaccines you get. It's all about, hey, we haven't seen each other for what, a year and a half. So, hello, welcomes, and we probably need to brush up on our social skills and such. But the ugly thing is that what this pandemic revealed is a disturbing lack of leadership in Western countries, both Canada and the US. And if we are to do a little comparative politics, the mm, American society has a much more well-grounded distrust of their government. So when the pandemic hits, even when Trump or Biden is president, people still maintain that level of distrust. But for Canada, I believe, having been there for a good 4 years, I think people trust their government a bit more, local and federal alike. So every legal measure that Justin Trudeau has put forward ever since the pandemic started, I think betrayed the public in such a gross way that I think most Canadians are not familiar with.
I think you're right. And that's one of the great things that resulted out of the convoy was the things that got exposed, like the liberal government, like our mainstream media, like corporations like GoFundMe and banking institutions that, wanted us labeled as terrorists so that they could seize all of our assets.
Mhm.
I think what the convoy did was really open up a lot of eyes to what's really going on. And I think a lot of people understand that Canada is in trouble, but I don't think they realized how far down the slope we've already slid, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So it really exposed a lot of things that have been happening in this country. And the mainstream media, for sure, the lies that they were telling. I mean, thank goodness for independent journalists and citizen journalists and cell phones, just people that were on the ground taking live footage. You know what I mean? It really captured what was really happening and not what the mainstream media was telling the rest of the world was happening.
Mhm. So one of the outlets that covered the truckers' protests extensively, and one that you actually got a book deal out of, Rebel News. Um, it's one of those independent media outlets. I've heard of them. They are right leaning, obviously. Ezra Levin has a extensive career before that. A friend of mine has a book where he tells he tells his own experience of publishing a series of Danish cartoons making fun of the Islamic prophet Muhammad, and both the Western as well as the I guess Islamic media outlets vilified him for it, even though that is fully within the Canadian Charters of Rights and Freedoms to publish these things, even though they are blasphemous as they may be. So I give a lot of respect for Ezra and Rebel News to approach you and sign your book into publication. So tell me about how that meeting come about.
Yes, well, Ezra, we've been talking. Obviously, I knew that I had an important story that I wanted to tell. And Ezra had approached me about having them publish it, which I thought was fantastic because I don't know the first thing about how to that stuff works. So yeah, we had a Zoom meeting and we chatted about, the story that we wanted to tell, and he said he wanted it in about 200 pages. And I kind of laughed because I said, there's no way we can get this story. I mean, it's such a huge story. And, but we did it. Yeah, we did it. We got it into 224 pages. Rebel has been absolutely amazing every step of the way. They've been very helpful. They've guided me. And the whole process itself, I found was very therapeutic for me to talk about my story. That was the first time I've really been able to, up until the POEC inquiry that we had here in the fall. So it was a great experience. Rebel made it a great experience. And I was shocked at how fast the book took off. We just did a soft launch, and within 24 hours, it was already on the bestseller list. So hats off to Rebel for everything that they've done to help. It's been an amazing experience.
Yeah, I'm very glad to hear. So of course,
Yes.
going back to the mainstream media, so do you remember how you were portrayed when they found out that you were part of this big movement?
Oh yes, and I'd been following politics enough to know I knew what was coming, and we talked about it. I knew that the racism accusations were going to come at us hard and fast. And as you probably know, I am Indigenous. I am Métis and Scottish. And so one of the first things that they did was to try to paint me as a liar and that wasn't true. They really questioned my heritage, which they wouldn't have normally done if we would have been protesting, say, for Black Lives Matter or something that our prime minister believed in. They never would have questioned my heritage. They would be celebrating it. But because what we were doing didn't fit with their ideology, they vilified us right away. So I was totally expecting it. And as they started coming at us with these terrible accusations and name calling, I mean, our message remained the same. We're peaceful, we're going to be respectful, and we're just going to Ottawa to be heard. So and we kept that, you know, it was probably the most peaceful and polite protest of all time in true Canadian fashion.
Hmm. Yes, and I think from what I've read, there has been no like significant violence being inflicted from anybody by anybody who were participating. And but of course, everybody has to complain about the honking, and apparently there are Nazi comparisons to honking, as if Canada geese do not exist.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Hmm. And
Excuse me.
I suppose even before the pandemic started, I think we can see there's a certain leaning and bias that I guess outlets like the CBC and I guess the Toronto Star has, in that when they cover the anything regarding fossil fuels or natural gas, and you're very much familiar with this, obviously if they do not lean on the environmental impact of fossil fuels, they would move on to a different aspect, and that this his right home, I think, in that Canada, especially recently, has had a supposed reckoning in regards to its history with the indigenous nations, and virtually all the coverage I've seen regarding the Alberta fossil fuel industry is framed as if there are these big oil companies, and they were building these pipelines, and these pipelines traverses or trespasses through the lands of indigenous nations. But I think on closer read, at least from my research, the it's not like the indigenous nations and the tribes are of one voice in it. Like there are some who support the pipeline being built through their land because of the economic benefits, and some because they favor, I guess, the integrity of their land. I guess do not. But what I'm saying that is that there is debate in this issue. So tell me about your experience on this particular issue.
Yes, you're right. There are a lot of First Nations in Canada that are very supportive of our oil and gas industry, and then of course there are some that aren't supportive. So I mean, it's a matter of finding the middle ground there, I guess. And but I think as far as the pipelines that were there was three or four pipelines that we were supposed to get built. Energy East, which was supposed to carry Alberta oil out to the east. The Trans Mountain, which we have already, we were supposed to twin that one. So in that respect, the pipeline would have ran just alongside the existing one, anyways. And they kiboshed all of that,
Mhm.
which is really, really unfortunate because, you know, that doesn't just benefit, you know, us down here in say Medicine Hat or, you know, southern Saskatchewan. That does benefit the First Nations as it goes economically as well too. It provides jobs for them and income for each band. So, you know, I think that's definitely an uphill battle, and we just need to keep the lines of communication open and explain the benefits in a responsible way instead of the fear mongering that we tend to get from our leaders.
Mhm. So um, a related story in that obviously one of the big stories that came out of Canada before the truckers convoy protest is that in the province of British Columbia, I believe, they unearthed a supposed mass graves of people who were residential school students. And
Yes.
I think there was this journalist named Terry Glavin who was skeptical of the, I guess, mainstream media narrative, and he was vilified for it. But I think the story itself does open up a discussion that is hopelessly one-sided, if you believe the mainstream media, about Canada's history in regards to its Indigenous people. So I wonder, drawing from your First Nations perspective, what do you make of Canada's history in regards to its First Nations population?
Well, I think that they were treated horribly and unfairly. When I look back at our history and how the First Nations were treated and kicked off their land, it's really unfortunate and heartbreaking what they've done to the people and to their culture. That yes, the residential schools are a blight on our history for sure. I think in some respects they were created in hopes of integrating them into society, but not all of them were positive places to be. And as a result, yes, there is the mass graves that they found um, around a lot of these schools. There was a lot of sickness back then also. So I think the problem is the mainstream media, I think, tries to make it sound like all these graves are from kids that were beaten or tortured or treated horribly. And I'm sure horrifyingly enough that is the case in some of the cases, but the majority of them were sick. And you're talking about a time when medicines and stuff like that, treatments weren't readily available.
Mhm.
So it's an incredible thing to try and overcome, to reconcile both of our sides. One of the clan mothers that was with me in Ontario, actually, for the convoy, wrote in her witness statement about the convoy something that I find is very profound. And she said she is a former chief of the Dene people in the Northwest Territories. And she said the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa was the closest thing that she's actually seen to a real reconciliation in her lifetime,
Mhm.
which is quite a statement,
Wow.
you know? So yeah, I mean, I think again, just have to keep both sides keep talking and working together for a common purpose. I don't think it matters again what color your skin is or what God you worship. I think we all have the fundamental goal of trying to make our country a better place for our children and our grandchildren.
Mhm. Yes, and I guess on a more local level, I wonder if you've had encounters with tribal or national leaders and representatives who may be reluctant or object to first the pipelines and the fossil fuel industry, and if so, how do you I guess reconcile those differences?
Yeah, no, I haven't. I haven't actually. No one's really reached out to me in regards to that. So again, I think the best way is through educating each other on our perspectives and looking for ways that we can achieve a common objective, whether that's exploring in our oil and gas industry or just being good to each other.
Mhm. Yes. So because you guys share a border with the United States, one of the things that I think both the Canadian government as well as the American mainstream media like to do is to draw parallels between American politics and Canadian politics, as well as their history and society and culture, where none exists. So, for example, the supposed reckoning regarding Canada's history with its Indigenous peoples is, I think, directly inspired by the U.S.'s racial reckoning in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and the 1619 Project. So Canada has to find a supposed equivalent of that, and they found that in the Indigenous history. And secondly, um, a year before the Freedom Convoy started, there was this horrible riot where a massive amount of Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol. And I think much of American media as well as Canadian media were making the Freedom Convoy protesters like the January 6th crowd who are intending to overthrow the government or something like that.
They absolutely did. Well, I think they wanted it. I mean, they were provoking us at every turn. They
Mhm.
were looking for something like that. Now, I don't know if you remember, but our prime minister was considering invoking the Emergencies Act at the beginning of COVID.
Oh.
So he had kind of an itchy trigger finger there. He couldn't wait to invoke the Emergencies Act. And I mean, they were talking about it very early on in the protests before there was any need even to discuss it. So, and then throughout the convoy, what we noticed is that, first they started with the raids. They raided Coventry and took fuel and firewood and food. And then they were threatening to come and take people's pets, and then they were threatening to come and take people's children. So could you imagine if you're down at the protest with your kids and then the police all of a sudden come in and start apprehending your children? That's going to upset a lot of people. And so we were very conscientious of that right from the start, that they were provoking and provoking and provoking. And to the credit of the Canadian people, they never succumbed. They never fought back. They never fought for it. I sat on my couch for 2 days after I got home from jail last winter, and I cried like a baby when I saw the violence and the way that the police came after the police or the Canadians in the takedown, dismantling the convoy, and still, not a single person so much as gave him the middle finger. There was no cursing and swearing and name calling. They just held their ground very politely, very respectfully, and they got trampled on.
Mhm. Yes. So you're actually the second person who I've talked to on this show who's been arrested and jailed because of some violations of COVID legal regime or another. The first one being Maxime Bernier. I believe he
Mm.
was holding a rally, and the I think the Ottawa police came for him. Um, I think it does bring us to the conversation about the mainstream media, because the way I see it, the purpose of any media in general is to be a bulwark against the government or the state. Even if it is state funded, you have to be somewhat critical and skeptical of what the government has to say, right? And that's what the
Mhm.
tribunes of ancient Roman times do. But these days, the media has been distorted in that it's doing two things. It reflects the interests and the values of a certain benighted and anointed class that includes people who are working in the government. And two, it treats any perspective that is not theirs, left or right, as wrong, as immoral, or those collection of words, racist, sexist, xenophobic,
Yes.
etc. So uh, given your experience with the media, what do you believe what do you believe the role of the media in general should be?
Well, I believe the role is for them to hold our government to account, and that it's a slippery slope. When you lose your media, you lose free speech, and when you lose your freedom of speech, the rest of your freedoms just roll along right after them. So it's very, very important that we continue to hold our mainstream media's feet to the fire and hold them accountable for their lies. It's and it became so obvious. I really noticed a shift in the mainstream media during the 2016 American election.
Mhm.
And because I was that woman, I would get up in the morning and turn on CTV News, and I would watch the loop with my coffee and then listen as I got ready for work. And what I noticed, and I believe it's been happening for a lot longer than then, but this is when it became very apparent to me. And as I watched the anchor people talk about Hillary Clinton, and then they would completely shift when they would start talking about Donald Trump. The tone of their voice would change, the look on their face would change, the descriptors that they used would change. And so it became really apparent that they were biased. And that's not your job. Your job is not to give me your opinion. Your job is to give me the facts and let me create my own opinion. And so I became very concerned for the state of our media during that time period, and it's only gotten steadily worse.
Mhm.
And then in Ottawa, for example, I mean, you got the CBC News out there in the convoy, specifically turning their camera to look at smaller crowds to make it seem like there wasn't that many people here when literally all they had to do was turn their camera to show this big, beautiful celebration and all these Canadian flags. And so it's really concerning. And it's really concerning because there's a lot of people out there that only watch CNN or they only watch CBC, so they're not getting the entire story. And I'm not saying that you need to listen to me and believe everything I say. I encourage people to go out and do their due diligence, put in a little effort and do some research on your own and come to your own conclusions. But the days of blindly listening to the media for me are long gone, long gone.
Mhm. Yes. I remember when some months after Elon Musk took over Twitter, um, there was something the CBC, his Twitter account, to complain to him that, hey, we're not actually 70% funded by the government, and so Elon, in his great sense of humor, changed their Twitter bio into CBC. We are 69% funded by the government of Canada, which is terribly
That's
funny.
right. It was funny. Yes, it was funny.
But it does reveal the fact that outlets such as CBC has become basically state TV, right? It's become an arm of the government. It's become, the speaker of
No question.
the cabinet and such. And so
No question.
when the time when I think the government should be held into account, and this is, I think, it's a very scary turn in the protest saga, and that Trudeau actually invoked the Emergencies Act, and those who they knew to have participated in the convoy had their bank accounts frozen, right?
Yes.
That should be when these media outlets step up and do what they are supposed to do. But did CBC and the big outlets do that?
No. They followed the direction of the government, and that evidence all came out in the POEC. I mean, they had crafted this whole narrative that we were but just a bunch of terrorists and racists
Mhm.
between the Prime Minister's office and the Public Safety Office and the media before I even met Chris Barber in person. Before I even got in the truck and we started heading out to Ottawa, they already had their whole narrative crafted, which was extremely disappointing.
Mhm. So, were you personally affected by these emergency measures?
Yes, obviously I was arrested. I've spent 48 days in jail total, 48 nights. And my bank account was frozen. Chris and I are co-accused, so our trial isn't going to be heard until September the 5th, and that's going to go into October. So yeah, I mean it's changed my life for sure. Luckily enough, our account was unfrozen as we were traveling back from Ottawa because my husband and I at that time only had a joint account. So, I mean, while they were targeting me, maybe, the fallout was my husband or in other people's cases, their families back home couldn't buy food or medicine or pay their rent, because their accounts were all frozen. So, and you just nailed it. I mean, and the media didn't do anything about it. I mean, here's the banking executives and presidents requesting the government label us as terrorists, and the media didn't even question it.
Mhm. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
So,
Yeah, any attempt at, I think, martial law is scary and should be, examined carefully. And of course, this harkens back to an episode in Canadian history where Justin Pierre's father, Pierre, invoked the same measures to combat the October crisis. But
yes.
but I think Pierre Trudeau Senior's act can be justified in some ways because the people who were terrorizing Quebec were violent and they were terrorists. So it can be partly justified, but in this case, it was totally unjustifiable and dictatorial because you guys were not violent. you guys were not terrorists, but the government apparently was afraid of you.
Well, and one of the things that has to be in place to invoke the Emergencies Act is that there has to be a threat to national security.
Mhm.
And there was no threat to national security. We had intelligence from our top intelligence agencies come out during the inquiry and testify to that fact. There was no violence. It wasn't a threat to national security. The other grassroots protests that had formed at the borders that were blocking the borders had all been cleared away before he even invoked the Emergencies Act. So, I mean, basically, what the outcome of the inquiry showed also was that the bar to invoke the act is strictly government incompetence and hurt feelings.
Mhm. Wow. So I wonder during this arduous time when you were, I guess, in prison and awaiting trial, did you receive any support coming from outside of Canada?
Tons
Oh,
and tons.
congratulations.
I've got cards and letters from the United States, Norway, Italy, Sweden, Scotland, Ireland, England. I've received so much love and support from all the corners of the earth. I'm so blessed, and it's so appreciated.
Which is a beautiful thing because no matter which corner you are in the world, the love for human freedom and the desire for human dignity is value. It's
It
a
is.
human universal. So I wonder if after this episode, have you, I guess, has your views on the government or Canadian democracy and uh, your, I guess, your freedoms and I guess the extent to which the government can guarantee them, have they changed at all?
I think that now it's more important than ever that people educate themselves and that they get involved. I mean, and I don't think, that means you got to run for prime minister. You need to get involved in every level, whether it's municipal politics or joining a local school board, writing to your elected representatives, email, writing, calling, book appointments. I mean, we have to stay on top of them and we have to make them listen. And I know that that's hard for a lot of people because, like we were saying earlier, people are busy. They just want to go to work and they want to collect their paycheck, pay their taxes, and raise their families. Unfortunately, if we don't do something, then we're going to continue down this path of totalitarianism, which is quite frightening. So I think it's time. Again, we all stay together, we stay unified, we keep it respectful, and we just keep holding them to account.
Mhm. Yes, I think the obviously right now, not just in Canada, but in Western countries in general, we are facing two very grave threats to democracy. And that the first one being that there is a ruling elite class, which is getting more and more distant from the people they are supposed to be ruling. And that can create a entirely different set of values where these people have a sense of what they believe freedom should be and what democracy should be. And and apparently that includes stifling the voices of genuine populist, legitimate populist grievances. And secondly, they have there's a divide between these classes too, and they show a disdain toward people who are not of their own class. Don't you think?
Yes, 100%. Yeah. And I really got the feeling that that's kind of what Ottawa was. It was we were looked down upon because we were just the dirty working class people that had come to dirty up the streets of Ottawa.
Mhm.
There is and we call them the laptop class.
Yeah.
And the laptop class during the pandemic got raises. They got to work from home. They never missed a paycheck.
Mhm.
They got to sit at home and talk about what great people they were because they were just staying at home doing nothing. While, the rest of society didn't have that luxury. The rest of the population either lost their jobs or their businesses or their paycheck or had to continue working. we didn't have that. We didn't have that luxury. And there was a disdain, I would say, for having us blue collar workers on their streets in Ottawa. So that has to change. Um, we're all human beings. We're all just human beings here doing the best we can.
Mhm. I think one of the key example of this disdain or this separation between the two classes is I saw a video where I guess an executive of a multi-million billion dollar company, and after she got a big bonus during Christmas, and after many her employees or of the company's employees were laid off, she actually made this like Zoom video where she was like trying to express emotions, and she was just basically saying like we need to be more forgiving, and we need to stick together. Like we can all get through this together. While she got this $1 million bonus check, and everyone she was talking to got laid off.
Yeah. And our government did the same. When the pandemic first hit and they were sending us all home and determining who was essential and who was not essential, in April of 2020, the Liberal government gave themselves a big raise. And then the following year, they gave themselves two raises. So to me, that signaled right away that this wasn't really an emergency. Like it wasn't as scary as what they were saying. And I was absolutely shocked that people that I saw and cared about that, were losing their paychecks and their jobs. And then here you got the government of Canada working from home, giving themselves raises. I mean, that money could have went to support mental health. Look at the mental health crisis that
Oh
this
yeah.
has caused, or even at the onset, right? That could have gone into drug prevention. Look at the opioid crisis that's happened as a result of the pandemic. I mean, that money that they got should have been spread out to help the rest of Canada. Why are they giving themselves raises in the middle of this? It didn't make any sense to me.
Hmm. And of course, meanwhile, they are trotting to Davos and meeting with other world leaders to
Yes,
plan the next upcoming world order and such.
that's right. Exactly.
So, final question. Do you believe that at this junction in time, the truckers' Freedom Convoy protest has achieved its objectives?
Well, we were still on our way to Ottawa last winter. I think it was our third or fourth day. And I remember Chris was talking over his CB radio, and he said to everyone, we've already won, guys. And he's right, we have already won. I think we achieved much more than we ever set out to do. I think, like I said, the things that got exposed throughout, we never intended for that to happen. It just happened. And the result was a great awakening. People saw what their mainstream media was like. People really saw what their government was like. Uh, their banking institutions and these corporations, and how everything is tied in with politics now. And so I think, at the end of the day, a lot of people will say I'm crazy because we have these charges against us and this massive $400 million civil suit. But for me personally, I feel like the luckiest woman alive. I've got to meet so many beautiful people. The support and the love that we've had has been amazing. And I think we won and achieved much, much more than we even set out to do.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Tamara Leach,
Thank you.
true Canadian, for joining this program.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, I wish you all the best with your book as well as your legal troubles moving forward.
Thank you very much.
And take care of yourself.
I will. You too.